I feel like the whole country needs to know what's going on here. It's bigger than alarming.
This is the worst I've ever seen it.
I witnessed this dystopian nightmare of this uncontrolled flow of desperate humanity crossing the border and converging here because of misbegotten policies by high leadership of the United States.
When President Biden took office, he signed some executive orders that basically halted all wall construction. It put our agents at risk. It put the migrants at risk. It incentivized the profit making for the smugglers.
At the end of the day, this is a business. Billions and billions of dollars every month are earned from transporting people across into the United States.
These kids are being exploited all along this track. There's nothing humane about any of this.
In this room, obviously, we designed it to be as comfortable as we can possibly make it, because the reality is no child should ever have to come to this exam room.
Mi señora y mi hija están conmigo, pero mi hija de 18 años, no sé dónde está.
We see a lot of violence as people are making across the border through Mexico or their countries. We see that devastation in the human lives.
What happens if the family doesn't have the money to buy the plane ticket?
Well, FEMA reimburses us. We can buy that ticket and
So you buy the ticket for them?
yes.
They were told they could get a bite at the American dream here, and that dream becomes a nightmare along the journey.
We are very pleased and honored to be joined now by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., obviously a presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, former environmental lawyer and activist, and maybe some say still is. Mr. Kennedy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Brian, for having me.
Sure. This is CNBC. So we're going to give a CNBC interview. We're going to talk about the issues that matter to our audience, which is business, the economy, markets, maybe a little international relations, energy, et cetera. I'm going to start off with this very simple question. Finish this sentence. The American economy right now is what?
In trouble.
Why? A lot of the economic data is good. Consumer spending is good.
Yeah, we're $33 trillion in debt. We have two presidential candidates who are saying they brought prosperity to this country, but you've got 57% of the American people who cannot put their hands on $1,000 if they have an emergency. And for those people, the engine light goes on in their car, and it's like the apocalypse happened. It's the end of the world for them. We have now, kids can't afford houses. The housing price has gone from $200,000, $215,000 2 years ago to $400,000 today. You know, I have 7 kids who are in the range 20 to 35. And almost none of their friends are buying houses. That was part of the American dream, that if you worked hard, you played by the rules, you could afford a house, you could take a summer vacation, you could raise a family, put money aside for retirement, and that was with one job, and that's not happening.
Well, now it's about, I think you tweeted about this, about half the country, the median income is below...
Is $5,000
less than the cost of living.
Right.
So you basically have to have 2 jobs.
You have to have 2 jobs,
But how do we do, and you said your economic plan is going to fix that. How do we fix that? Because this seems structural over years or decades even.
Yeah. And well, number one, we have to unravel the warfare business, the warfare machine. That is bankrupting our country. That, and you know, Paul Kennedy, who's a Yale historian, has done this extraordinary history on the decline of empires, and every empire in the last 500 years, its death knell was overextending its military abroad. We've spent $8 trillion on wars over the past 20 years, since 2002, that have gotten us nothing, that have made it less safe to be an American, our country less safe. The Chinese spent $8 trillion during that same period while we were bombing bridges, ports, roads, schools, universities, hospitals. They were building them, and they're now the principal creditor for almost every nation in Latin America and every country, virtually every country in Africa. Our wars have now, not only bankrupted the middle class in this country.
How was tie the war to the middle class? Because that's where you're losing me a little bit. And I understand straight defense spending. Anything we spend on defense is not going to be spent on something else. And I think on your proposal, you want to dramatically cut the Department of Defense spending by hundreds of billions.
Yeah, when we were told in 1992 that we were going to cut it from 660 billion because we were going to get the peace.
The fall of the Soviet Union, we're going to have peacetime, the peace dividend.
We were going to cut it to 200 billion, and that would give us enough money to arm ourselves to the teeth at home, make ourselves too expensive to ever invade, and start reinvesting that intellectual capital and the currency capital back into building an industrial base in this country, and it never happened. Instead of going to 200 billion, we went to 1.3 trillion. We spend more on our military than the next 10 nations combined, and it's not making our country richer, it's making us poorer.
So how would cutting the defense budget help the middle class?
Well, in a number of different ways. I mean, first of all, we're going to lower our deficits. We can bring a lot of that money home. I mean, if we hadn't spent that $8 trillion, Brian, we could extend the life of solvency for Social Security loan for 30 years. We could pay for university educations for every child in America. We could pay off the credit card debt in our country for individuals. We could...
So take the DOD spending cuts. This is primary to your economic plan. Transfer that money into other things.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not the only thing I want to do. I have a number of direct programs that are common sense programs that will begin restoring the middle class in this country in dramatic ways.
Okay, what's another one?
Well, one of them is to create, one of the big problems, one of the reasons that the price of housing has gone up and nobody can get a house anymore. People make an offer on a house, and then somebody comes in with a cash offer of...
a lot of these are big institutions, by the way.
They're big institutions.
Wall Street firms.
BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street.
Buying up hundreds of thousands of homes.
Right. Their objective now, they own 88% of the S&P 500. Now they're targeting single-family homes. They're competing with our kids, and they have these big bank books. So the cost of money and mortgages to them is minuscule, and our kids now have to compete with them. And, Thomas Jefferson said American democracy has to be based on independent freehold ownership of independent freeholds by tens of thousands of American citizens, each with a stake in our system of government. We're now moving back to a feudal system.
Yeah, but what do we do about it, Mr. Kennedy? Do we make it illegal for insert big Wall Street bank name here to buy up mass amounts of property?
You change the tax code to make it more difficult for large corporations to accumulate thousands of houses. But here's a direct program. If you have a rich uncle who will co-sign your mortgage, you can get a much lower rate because the bank is basing it on his, his credit rating rather than yours. So I'm going to give everybody a rich uncle, which is Uncle Sam, who will guarantee mortgages for first-time single-family home buyers at 3% interest. That will reduce the average price of mortgage by $1,000 a month. I will finance that not by increasing our debt, which I'm not going to do, but rather by selling tax-free 3% bonds to finance it. That will allow,
I'm hearing shades of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in my head, though. This is where, and they run into their own problems. We've covered them. How would your plan be different than what currently exists?
Well, we have now surplus in Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Oh, and that would be, I could tie those institutions into this program. But we need this program. We had 50 years of prosperity in this country after World War II. Economists and social scientists call it the Great Prosperity. The American middle class. We were the only
manufacturer of size because we obliterated Japan and Europe. Europe was obliterated, and we obliterated Japan.
And also, the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. We owned half the wealth on the face of the earth. But the big boom took off after World War II when we got Americans into houses with the GI Bill and a number of other bills that made it cheap for Americans to purchase a house at low interest rates. And that was kind of the beginning of this impetus that made us so wealthy.
Would you raise taxes on people making under $400,000 a year?
No, I would not. I'm not going to raise taxes. I'm not going to raise taxes. I don't think that that's the right thing to do right now. I think we really need to stimulate our economy. Another thing that I'm going to do is to create, and this is a program that we announced this week, and it's a program that my uncle, Ted Kennedy, John McCain, originally advanced in 2007, and then it was advanced by a number of the civil rights leaders, including Andrew Young and a number of others, for a whole lot of reasons. A very good idea to make passport cards free. So one of the big penalties against being working poor in this country is that a lot of the working poor do not have a federal photo ID. And under the Patriot Act, the banks have all of these provisos that make them investigate your ID. So, and they don't want to handle small accounts from poor people.
So it'll cut the cost for people. You're trying to lower costs for working class families.
It will do a number of things. One, it will solve the immigration crisis, which is another huge depressant on wages and on the welfare of the middle class in this country. For the first time, we will have a federal ID. Every American can get this now for free from their local post office. There's 33,000 post offices in this country. It will clear up some of the problems with the voting system, so everybody will be able to show an ID to vote. You won't right now, if you're at a construction site here in New York, or you and I were talking earlier about Nashville, the only ID that is required for most construction sites is a Social Security card. Those have no photo on them. They can be easily fabricated. They're passed from person to person. They penalize union membership because the non-union sites who are taking fake IDs from people can now, pay. And with this huge influx of immigrants, they're now paying $5, $6 an hour to people who are willing to work for that because there's no other jobs they can get. And if you had an ID that everybody had,
but you understand that, I mean, people, when you start talking about that, they start about government tracking, they start talking about this is discriminatory, what about the people that are already here? Do they get the path to citizenship and the path to work?
This is a barrier against government tracking. It puts out of it ends the arguments that people say that we need vaccine passports and medical passports and mandatory, obligatory government ID. It's government ID if you want it, but it becomes available. There are many people, like in New York City. In poor
so it's
neighborhoods.
Not mandatory to the plan.
Not mandatory. It just becomes available for free to anybody who wants it.
We've got running out of time, but there's a number of quick topics I'd like to just kind of power through if I could, Mr. Kennedy. You said in 2017, I think it was a sold-out event in New Paltz, New York. We need a new energy economy. All right, you're an environmental lawyer and activist. What do you think of the Inflation Reduction Act?
I don't like the
Because isn't that the new energy economy that you spoke of 6 years ago?
I think that the Inflation Reduction Act was hijacked by industry, by particularly the carbon industry, that, carbon capture, there's $173 billion in subsidies in that act for carbon capture. We need free market capitalism. And we need to end the subsidies to the carbon industry. Listen, right now, you can build a solar plant in this country. Capital costs of a solar plant are about $1 billion a gigawatt. A coal plant is $3.6 billion a gigawatt. So, and a nuke plant is $14 billion a gigawatt.
Yeah, but nuke is always on.
No, it isn't. The
nuclear is always on.
No. They have more maintenance outages with nuclear power plants than almost any other sector.
You do have maintenance. You'll have some water issues. I agree, but for the most part,
but if it's
fusion,
listen, you can
is the sun.
Well, we don't have fusion.
Fission, fusion. You get my. I wish we did have cold fusion. By the way, we could create limitless energy, and there are some encouraging. There are some encouraging little, science programs.
Yeah, but we don't have that.
What is your view on nuclear power?
My view is that I'm all for it if they ever make it safe and if they ever make it economic. We can make energy by burning prime rib. You know, why wouldn't we take the cheapest form of energy?
By the way. You know,
why wouldn't we take the cheapest form of energy possible?
So what do we do? What's the new energy economy then? Wind, solar, get rid of the subsidies for the carbon capture?
Get rid of the subsidies. There's $5.2 trillion in subsidies annually for carbon. There are small subsidies, relatively small, for wind and solar. But, you know, we have an abundant, and other geothermal, et cetera.
What about the oil industry here in the United States? Energy independence. We've learned, Europe has shown us, if you don't have a steady supply of relatively inexpensive energy, you're in big trouble. Germany, I probably saw the New York Times piece yesterday, they're in big trouble in part, not only because of, but in part because of high energy costs.
We blew up their pipeline.
Well, I don't want to go down that road because that hasn't been proven.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the war,
the pipeline was blown up.
And the war in Ukraine, which was an unnecessary war from the beginning.
Fair, and pipelines have been shut off. Some have been blown up.
And there's
some have been
sanctions,
shut off.
and the sanctions, which are part of that whole, war. And let me tell you something else.
I think we learned the risk of being attached to foreign energy sources.
Well,
so where would U.S. oil and gas?
I agree with that.
Where would U.S. oil and gas fall in a Kennedy administration's? Because you're an environmental guy as well. Plan. And also, do you have a view on OPEC?
Well, right now, I mean, you asked me two huge questions there.
Running out of time, I'm trying.
A view on OPEC. I mean, the thing that we should be worried about right now is BRICS. And BRICS is going to own OPEC. And that is because we've weaponized, because of our war ideology has driven the acceleration of BRICS. And now you've got BRICS that's representing, I think, 47% of the world's population and 37% of GDP. But they now, with BRICS 11, you have Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, which control OPEC. So 90% of the energy is going to be.
I think you might have read my mind, since I have no notes, which is that was my final or close to final question was going to be about China. Okay, and particularly you've got the U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo over there. But I want to get your views on China. But you talked about BRICS. So if our viewers aren't familiar, Brazil, Russia, India, China, plus South America or South Africa, they're expanding. Now they're expanding the group dramatically.
Right.
It feels like kind of a huge. We talked about it on my show last week.
An alternative to the dollar as the world reserve currency.
So what would a Kennedy administration do to counter that growing counterweight that clearly is being run mostly by China?
Well, nobody wanted to start BRICS. Nobody wanted an alternative to the U.S. dollar. This happened because of our weaponization of the U.S. dollar or weaponization of our foreign policy, unilateral weaponization, and the weaponization of our control of the world currency, where we were impounding people's their personal assets if the government misbehaved and do it unilaterally. So we created it. We need to de-escalate our violence around the world, which has driven the creation of BRICS. But the answer to your question about China, China does not want a war with the United States. We spend 3 times on our military what they do. We have 800 bases abroad. They have 1.5. They're not they want to compete with us. They want to bury us. They want to do it on an economic playing field, and they need us. They cannot survive without us.
We're their marketplace.
Right.
We're the biggest buyer of Chinese goods by far.
Right, Walmart. So I'm not afraid of the United States competing with China head-to-head in countries around the world. I think that's good for us. I think we win that competition because we have freedom.
What about Nike, Apple, U.S. companies doing business there? If you were going to give advice to Tim Cook of Apple, what would it be?
Well, giving economic advice or, patriotic advice.
How about doing business in China?
I'm not somebody who thinks that we should divide the world or live on one planet, that we should divide the world into different sectors. I think the shared markets are ultimately good for the world because they decrease the chance of war. And that ultimately is the greatest threat. And I am not frightened I think the U.S. policy should always be, the government policy should be about fostering, developing, nurturing the middle class in this country. And that's what U.S. policy. But I don't think we should cut off trade with China. I think some of the things that are being done, for example, the programs to bring semiconductor.
The CHIPS Act.
The CHIPS Act, I don't like the fact that we're giving subsidies to the richest companies in the world, but I do think it's prudent to be able to make semiconductors here in the United States. And I'd like to see more of that, trying to bring the industry home.
Yeah.
But I'm not, I don't think we should be rattling the sabers with China. When you treat somebody as an adversary, they tend to become one. And we did the same thing with China. And there are a group of people in the State Department and White House who want constant pipeline of new wars to feed the military-industrial complex of the nation, not be driving our foreign policy.
Two final questions, Mr. Kennedy. Number one, this is a little bit out on crypto. Should we back 10% of U.S. government debt with cryptocurrency? I mean, we're off the gold standard 50 years now.
Okay, 10%. You mean like
or a number?
You mean selling T-bills with that
backed by crypto or any U.S. government obligation? Not backed by gold, but by the digital gold.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I like the idea of having some attachment to a base currency for at least some portion of the T-bills out there. I think it enforces discipline in them against, just printing money endlessly. So, and that individuals and governments, et cetera, when they buy T-bills can get, my uncle did this in 1963. With silver certificates and gold certificates. He tried to return at least an option for base currency rather than fiat currency, which is destroyed the middle class in this country. It's become
I did not ask that question by accident, Mr. Kennedy. Final question, and I leave the politics to a lot of the other people and also some other issues that you may be familiar with that I think you've been asked a billion times. But I want to end on this note, because I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, there was an AP poll showed that 77% of Americans felt that President Biden was too old to serve another term, including 69% of Democrats. Now, whatever you may think of that, the Democratic National Committee has said that there will not be a primary debate, which I understand. Historically, incumbents do not face primary challengers or debates generally. I have a feeling I know what you're going to say, but make the case to the DNC for having a debate, one debate between you, any other candidate, and President Biden in front of the American people to maybe assuage some concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point, that there's a lot of misgivings now among a vast majority of both Republicans and Democrats about the president's capacity as mental acuity.
And again, I want to be clear, this is not my thought. This is AP poll, 69% of Democrats.
Yeah. So I think it's important for the president to have a debate to show that, this is a rigorous job, to show that he has the vigor, that he has the mental acuity, and to put those misgivings aside with the American people. But not only a debate, to have unscripted a conversation with voters and to do some retail politics. Now, if he's going to have to debate President Trump or whoever the Republican is at some point, and to say that that he should sit on the couch. Now it's like preparing for, telling a prize fighter, you got to prepare for this, for the prize fight, the championship, by sitting on a couch and eating Chick-fil-A. You need to be
Sounds
practicing.
delicious, by the way.
You need to be practicing, and you need and getting on your feet and getting on your toes and making sure that
Are you talking to him
this.
about getting one? Is there any chance that there would be a debate?
Well, we're asking him for one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the American people, and even Democrats who don't like me particularly because they've been misled about what I believe about certain things. But virtually all Democrats want to see a debate.
No. Well, I enjoyed having an unscripted conversation with you, Mr. Kennedy. It was, this kind of, I could have done an hour, but I appreciate you spending about 20 minutes with us and going through a variety of topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, sir.
Thanks,
Really
Brian.
appreciate it. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Democratic candidate for president.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
We have left it up to you to let what can be handled.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. And he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
We have some new polling numbers from the 2024 Democratic presidential primary contest. Joe Biden is still leading with 60% of the vote, while Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has enjoyed small gains on the presidential race. He's got 19% of the vote. Marianne Williamson has hit double digits. She is at 10%.
Now, Kennedy recently sat with Fox News' Jesse Waters in Central Park, where he railed on mainstream media for not allowing him to speak directly to their audiences.
CNN, MSNBC, did they invite you on?
No.
Why not?
You would have to ask them.
It seems like you'd be a natural fit over there. What do you think's changed?
CNN and MSNBC have become, openly partisan and very, very much aligned with the Democratic National Committee. And, they share the same sort of anger at my candidacy, and they don't, they'll do stories about me, but they won't allow me to talk directly to their audience.
Speaking of CNN, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries took to the network yesterday where he insisted voters know Joe Biden is a good and decent man, and he has nothing to worry about going into 2024.
Are you confident when you look at what the Justice Department has done, when you look at the investigations into Hunter Biden that the Republicans have pursued up to this point, that there hasn't been any wrongdoing, everything's been above board?
Yes, I'm extremely confident. The American people know fundamentally that Joe Biden is a good and decent man who's dedicated his life to public service and will continue to serve the people honorably and admirably. On the other hand, you've got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and George Santos and others who are running the show amongst the House Republican majority. It's an extreme group of people who aren't really trying to improve the lives of the American people. As Democrats, we're going to continue to put people over politics and to focus on lowering costs, better paying jobs, safer communities, growing the economy for the middle class, and delivering. That will be a clear contrast that will be available to us to present to the American people in November of 2024.
Does that ring true to you?
A man couldn't miss the point more. Who does he think he's convincing with this? Does he think that there are working class and poor Americans that are watching this program that said, well, cost of living has gone up exponentially over the last 20 years. Inflation is still making the price of groceries in the store difficult for me to feed my family.
Just as George Santos, the leader of the Republican Party, wanted.
The cost of education is skyrocketing. The cost of transportation is skyrocketing. But Hakeem Jeffries got on TV and told me that Joe Biden was a good person. So all is fine in the world.
That seems designed to push back on the corruption and the Hunter Biden accusations. I guess that's how they're trying to deflect from that. No, he's just a great father, best father, America's father, really. I don't.
Sounds like you were slipping into your Trump impression a little bit there. He's the best father.
Many people are saying such a good father. It's the first time hearing about it. Anyway.
Yeah, he also really misses the point about why people find the extreme right faction of the party to be inspiring. I think a lot of Republicans, they look at what, let's say, the priorities of the Freedom Caucus are, and they don't necessarily even agree with those priorities. Because there's poor and working class Republicans, too, who don't exactly think that, disbanding the FBI is going to put food in their stomach. Mm-hmm. However, what they do see is that there is a diversity of opinion among the Republican Party and a faction that is willing to fight ostensibly for them, at least in theory, for them.
You're kind of saying, say what you will about the tenets of National Socialism, but at least it's an ethos. Is that what you're doing?
Yes, except for that. I think that's,
Let's go.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to go back. If you want to say more on this, go ahead, because I want to go back to RFK Jr.
Sure.
You were talking about, why we've been discussing him a little bit less in maybe the last, 2 weeks or something, which you can have a news cycle. You can fade from the news cycle a little bit. There's no reason to think he might not come back. I do think his candidacy over time was drawing more and more, and it continues to draw more and more support from right-wing people. Obviously, that's not entirely true, and he's running as a Democrat, and actually a lot of Democrats have been turned off by Joe Biden's policies, particularly on foreign policy and COVID, where RFK Jr. is, most at odds with what mainstream Democrats want today. However, because of those are now kind of right-wing things, he had a lot of right-wing interest. And I think some of that right-wing interest is now that we've had the debates, there's more focus among right-wing people. Well, what does DeSantis think about this? What does Vivek Ramaswamy think about this? What do the other candidates think about this? And maybe that's why he's faded a little bit. Although, Fox News is still having him on. He just did that interview that we played some of with Jesse Waters, and he could very much have a media resurgence.
I think two things are happening here. One is what you've just pointed out, which is that now that there's real conservatives in the race, there's no need, or they've always been in the race, but now that there are media events that are highlighting the words, thoughts, and feelings and policies of actual conservatives in the GOP race, there's less of a need to cater to or really platform RFK Jr. from the conservative. But also, I do think that, some of the substantive gaffes, let's call them, that he had at the end of last month. You can say that they were in bad faith, but I do think they ultimately dinged him. I think a lot of this organic, real support that he did have on the left for his anti-war views was really diminished by his stance on Israel-Palestine. I don't see him on my leftist timeline at all anymore. I don't think that there's anybody who has much confidence in him because Palestinian rights are such a foundational issue to the left. And then back on the right, I do think that the liberal press was enjoying using him as a kind of a whipping boy to make to grandstand about how terrible certain conservative beliefs were that they thought were being funneled through and platformed by RFK Jr. And now that there are so many other conservatives saying other things that are considered to be wrong and out of step with public opinion, Democrats can just talk about what Vivek Ramaswamy or DeSantis or somebody like that has to say. They don't need him anymore to make the argument that Republicans
beliefs are bad. He still seems very popular, I should say, among some of my people, among many libertarians. So I don't know if there's an opening for him there, if he's so committed to remaining a Democrat and seeing this through. But it looks to me like there's an opening for him
to this particular interview. I mean, many liberals have been arguing that the only reason that the right has been interested in RFK Jr. is because since he's running as a Democrat, they are just elevating him as a knock against Joe Biden. And, I don't think that that's necessarily, I don't think it's fair to use that argument to discount what I think is legitimate organic interest in RFK Jr. However, I do think that that is obviously happening. Do I think that Jesse Waters is ever going to vote for someone like RFK Jr., genuinely supportive of someone like RFK Jr.? Not really. It obviously advantages conservatives for there to be more division in the Democratic primary. I support that, by the way, because I think there should be a real primary. But I do think that's part of what's happening when you see them kind of scoop him back up out of irrelevance.
Sure, although I don't want to underemphasize that, he is taking the fight to Biden on two or three issues, again, in particular, the COVID stuff and the Ukraine stuff, where, conservatives are all about what he's saying and are cheering him and, want those policies enacted and wish the Democratic administration would be less inclined to require vaccinations and lockdowns and everything else, and the funding of Ukraine. So he is, it's not just like they're not just platforming and celebrating and putting any Democrat on a pedestal because, suck at Joe Biden. They're doing this to someone who is most vocal on things that conservatives and independents and libertarians and contrarians and dissident Democrats think should be heard.
Well, look, I'll say this. They had Newsom on. Newsom is not some counter-establishment rabble-rouser, but the idea that Gavin Newsom would maybe get into the race was enough to get him a platform on Fox News. They've had Marianne Williamson on, who isn't a big kind of COVID anti-lockdown sort of a personality.
Well, they've had them on, and they should. That's a good,
of course they should, but the argument that they are platforming RFK Jr. kind of largely because they just believe in what he stands for. I'm not saying that there isn't that overlap of ideology. There obviously is. But I also do think it's a lot about wanting to stick it to the Democrats. And again, I don't have a problem with that at all. I'm so glad that they have an opportunity to go on Fox News. I just think that it's a little bit of a mix-up. If these people were not, if they were independent candidates, if they were somehow not advantageous to the Republican effort of splitting the primary vote and getting digs on Joe Biden, I just don't think there would be as much of an incentive rather to go ahead and do it. Yeah. Well, I think that's all for us on this topic. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.
I've come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. And my mission over the next 18 months of this campaign and throughout my presidency will be to end the corrupt merger of state and corporate power that is threatening now to impose a new kind of corporate feudalism on our country, to commoditize our children, our Purple Mountain's majesty, to poison our children and our people with chemicals and pharmaceutical drugs, to strip mine our assets, to hollow out the middle class, and keep us in a constant state of war.
After 2 years, a conversation with the President of the United States. Last evening in his office, Mr. Kennedy looked back at the first 2 years of his presidency and looked ahead. Talking with him for some 90 minutes were 3 White House correspondents: Bill Lawrence of ABC News, George Herman of CBS News, and Sandra Van Oker of NBC News. Now on the CBS television network, an hour of that conversation, edited and recorded on videotape.
As you look back upon your first 2 years in office, sir, has your experience in the office matched your expectations? You had studied a good deal the power of the presidency, the methods of its operation. How has this worked out as you saw it in advance?
Well, in the first place, I think the problems are more difficult than I had imagined they were. Secondly, there's a limitation upon the ability of the United States to solve these problems. We are involved now in the Congo in a very difficult situation. We've been unable to secure an implementation of the policy which we've supported. We are involved in a good many other areas. We are trying to see if a solution can be found to the struggle between Pakistan and India, with whom we want to maintain friendly relations. Yet they're unable to come to an agreement. There is a limitation, in other words, upon the power of the United States to bring about solutions. I think our people get awfully impatient and maybe fatigued and tired and say, we've been carrying this burden for 17 years. Can we lay it down? We can't lay it down, and I don't see how we're going to lay it down in this century, so that advise or speak or legislate and between the man who must select from the various alternatives proposed and say that this shall be the policy of the United States. Well, it's much easier to make the speeches than it is to finally make the judgments, because unfortunately your advisors are frequently divided. If you take the wrong course, and on occasion I have, the President bears the burden, responsibility quite rightly. The advisors may move on to new advice.
Well, Mr. President, that brings up a point that's always interested me. How does a president go about making a decision, like Cuba, for example?
The most recent one was hammered out, really, our policy and decision over a period of 5 or 6 days. During that period, the 15 people, more or less, who were directly consulted, frequently changed their view because whatever action we took had so many disadvantages to it. And each action that we took raised the prospect that it might escalate with the Soviet Union into a nuclear war. Finally, however, I think a general consensus developed and certainly seemed, after all alternatives were examined, that the course of action that we finally adopted was the right one. Now, when I talked to members of the Congress, several of them suggested a different alternative when we confronted them on that Monday with the evidence. My feeling is that if they had gone through the 5-day period we had gone through at looking at the various alternatives, the advantages and disadvantages of action, they probably would have come out the same way that we did. I think we took the right one. If we had had to act on the Wednesday in the first 24 hours, I don't think probably we would have chosen as prudently as we finally did, a quarantine against the use of offensive weapons. In addition, that had much more power than we first thought it did, because I think the Soviet Union was very reluctant to have us stop ships which carried with them a good deal of their highly secret and sensitive material. One of the reasons I think that the Soviet Union withdrew the IL-28s was because we were carrying on very intensive low-level photography. Now, no one would have guessed, probably, that that would have been such a harassment. Mr. Castro could not permit us to indefinitely continue widespread flights over his island at 200 feet every day. And yet he knew if he shot down one of our planes that then it would bring back a much more serious reprisal on him. So it's very difficult to always make judgments here about what the effect will be of our decisions on other countries. In this case, it seemed to me that we did pick the right one. In Cuba of 1961, we picked the wrong one.
I'd like to go back to the question of the consensus and your relationship to the consensus. You have said, and the Constitution says, that the decision can be made only by the President. Now, what was your relation to the consensus? Did you form no opinion until a consensus appeared, or were you part of forming the consensus? And had you disagreed with it, what then?
Well, I think that, well, you know, that old story about Abraham Lincoln in the cabinet. He says, all in favor say aye, and the whole cabinet voted aye, and then all opposed no, and Lincoln voted no, and he said the vote is no. So that naturally the Constitution places the responsibility on the President. There was some disagreement with the course we finally adopted, but the course we finally adopted had the advantage of permitting other steps if this one was unsuccessful. In other words, we were starting, in a sense, at a minimum place. Then, if that were unsuccessful, we could have gradually stepped it up until we had gone into a much more massive action, which might have become necessary if the first step had been unsuccessful. I would think that the majority finally came to accept that, though at the beginning there was a much sharper division. And after all, this was very valuable because the people who were involved had particular responsibilities of their own. Mr. McNamara, Secretary of Defense, who therefore had to advise me on the military capacity of the United States in that area, the Secretary of State, who had to advise on the attitude of the OAS and NATO, so that, in my opinion, the majority came to accept the course we finally took. It made it much easier. The Cuba of 1961, the advice of those who were brought in on the executive branch was also unanimous, and the advice was wrong. So that, and finally, and I was responsible, so it finally comes down that no matter how many advisors you have, frequently they are divided, and the President must finally choose. The other point is something that President Eisenhower said to me on January 19th. He said, there are no easy matters will ever come to you as President. If they're easy, they will be settled at a lower level. So the matters that finally come to you as President are always the difficult matters, and matters which carry with them large implications. So this contributes to some of the burdens of the office of the presidency, which other presidents have commented on.
During the Cuban crisis, there was some problem, which you're apparently familiar with and bored with by now, about the possibility of a president talking in very private and secret conversations with his advisors, and that somehow leaking out. Do you think that this is going to inhibit the free, frank flow of advice that every president has to have?
No, I think it's unfortunate when there's sort of conversations, but there are, 1,300 reporters accredited to the White House alone. There are, I suppose, 100 or 150 people who are familiar with what goes on because in the Security Council meetings, in one way or another, you've got the people who are actually there, and you've got others who are given instructions as a result of the decisions there, and I suppose people do talk, and then as I said at the time of the Cuban disaster of April '61 that success is 100 fathers and defeat's an orphan. I suppose when something goes well, there's more tendency to talk at all levels, and frequently the reports are inaccurate. I would say the security is pretty good at the National Security Council. It's unfortunate when it's breached.
Is it true that during your first year, sir, you would get on the phone personally to the State Department and try to get a response to some inquiry that had been made?
Yes, I still do that when I can, because it's, I think there's a great tendency in government to have papers stay on desks too long. And it seems to me that's one really of a function. After all, the president can't administer a department, but at least he can be a stimulant.
Do you recall any response that you received from somebody who wasn't suspecting a phone call in the State Department? Any specific response somebody made to you?
No, they always respond. They always say yes, but it takes a little while to get. You know, after I met Mr. Khrushchev in Vienna, and they gave us an aide-memoire. It took many weeks to get our answer out through the State Department, coordinate with the British, the French, and the Germans. It took much too long. It seems to me we've been able to speed it up, but this is a constant problem in various departments. There are so many interests that are involved in any decision. No matter what whether the decision is about Africa or Asia, it involves the Europe's desk, it involves the desk of the place, it involves the Defense Department, it might involve the CIA, it frequently involves the Treasury, it might involve the World Bank, or it involves the United Nations delegation. So it seems to me that one of the functions of the president is try to have it move with more speed. Otherwise, you can wait while the world collapses.
You once said that you were reading more and enjoying it less. Are you still as avid a newspaper reader, magazine? I remember those of us who traveled with you on the campaign, a magazine wasn't safe around you.
Oh, it is. No. I think it's invaluable, even though it may cause you it's never pleasant to be reading things frequently that are not agreeable news, but I would say that it's an invaluable arm of the presidency as a check, really, on what's going on in administration. And more things come to my attention that cause me either concern or give me information. So I would think that Mr. Khrushchev, for operating a totalitarian system which has many advantages as far as being able to move in secret and all the rest, there's a terrific disadvantage not having the abrasive quality of the press applied to you daily to an administration.
When you have,
even though we never like it, and even though we don't, even though we wish they didn't write it, and even though we disapprove, there isn't any doubt that we couldn't do the job at all in a free society without a very, very active press. Now, on the other hand, the press has the responsibility not to distort things for political purposes, not to just take some news in order to prove a political point. It seems to me their obligation is to be as tough as they can on administration, but do it in a way which is directed towards getting as close to the truth as they can get, and not merely because of some political motivation.
Mr. President, in the light of the election returns, which at the congressional level at least were certainly a defeat for the Republican hopes, how do you measure your chances for significant success domestically in the Congress just ahead?
Well, I think we'll be in about the same position of the last 2 years. I think that, as I say, what we have that's controversial will be very closely contested.
Did the complexion of the House change a little bit by these shifts?
I would say it's slightly against us more than it was. We're not quite as good shape as we was for the last 2 years, but we're about where we were the last 2 years, which means every vote will be 3 or 4 votes either way, winning or losing.
Do you have a very crucial vote at the outset on this Rules Committee fight again, do you think? And
I hope that the Rules Committee is kept to its present number, because we can't function if it isn't. We might as well, we're through if we lose, if they try to change the rules. Nothing controversial in that case would come to the floor of the Congress.
In other words,
the whole program, in my opinion, would be emasculated.
As a young congressman, sir, you voted to impose a 2-term limitation on presidents. Now that you've held the office for a while and also observed its effect on President Eisenhower's second term, would you repeat that vote even if the amendment did not apply to yourself?
Yes, I would. I know the conditions were special in 47, but I think 8 years is enough. And I'm not sure that a president, if he's, in my case, if I were reelected, that you're at such a disadvantage. There aren't many jobs. That isn't the power of the presidency, patronage at all. They're filled in the first month. Most of those jobs belong to the members of the Congress anyway, so patronage isn't a factor. I think there are many other powers of the presidency that run in the second term as well as the first.
Well, Mr. President, on that point,
the fact is President Eisenhower has great influence today in the Republican Party and therefore in the country, and has great influence in foreign policy. He doesn't even hold office. In some ways, his influence is greater to some degree. So that, and the same is really true of also of President Truman, President Hoover. I don't think that it depends on the influence of a president, still substantial in his second term, though I haven't had a second term. I think it is.
Are you looking forward to one, sir?
Mr. President, on that point, much of your program still remains to be passed by the Congress. There are some people who say that you either do it in the next 2 years or it won't be done should you be elected to a second term. Do you share that point of view?
You know, in the first place, I think we've got a lot by. I was looking at what we set out to do in January '61 the other day, and on taxes and on Social Security welfare changes and area redevelopment, minimum wage, the Peace Corps, the Alliance for Progress, the and strengthening the defenses, strengthening our space program. We did all those things. The trade bill, not perhaps to the extent in every case of our original proposal, but substantial progress. I think we can do some more the next 2 years. And I would think that there are going to be new problems in 60, if I were reelected in 65, and I don't look at the second term as necessarily a decline. I don't think that at all. In fact, I think you know much more about the position. It's a tremendous change to go from being a senator to being president. In the first months, it's are very difficult. But I have no reason to believe that a president with the powers of this office and the responsibilities placed on it, if he has a judgment that some things need to be done, I think he can do it just as well the second time as the first, depending, of course, on the makeup of the Congress. The fact is, I think the Congress looks more powerful sitting here than it did when I was there in the Congress. But that's because when you're in Congress, you're one of 100 in the Senate or one of 435 in the House. So that the power is so divided. But from here, I look at a Congress, and I look at the collective power of the Congress, particularly the block action, which if it wants to, and it's a substantial power.
Mr. President, power like charities, you know, it begins at home. And you seem to have one view of what we need to do at home, and Congress seems to have another view. A lot of money will be appropriated for defense and national security, but there's a certain reluctance to devote money to another form of capital investment, education, and other things like that at home. Is it purely a question of money, or is this religious thing really going to make it impossible for you to get the Education Act passed?
Well, education, it's certainly the question of how the funds will be distributed and how they will be shared is one of the factors. The integration question is another matter which comes into it. I think that, you know, Thomas Jefferson once said to expect the people to be ignorant and free is to expect what never was and never will be. Here we're going to have twice as many people trying to go to college in 1970 as 1960. That means we have to build as many buildings in 10 years as we built the whole 160 years of our country's history. Then you've got these millions of young boys and girls who are dropping out of school, who are unskilled at a time when skilled labor is needed and not unskilled. So we need money for vocational training to train them in skills, to retrain workers, to provide assistance funds for colleges, and then to provide assistance to those who are going to get doctorates, higher advanced in engineering, science, and mathematics. We have a severe shortage there, and yet we're asking for space, defense, and all the rest. The Soviet Union is concentrating on this. So all this requires funds, but it's all in controversy. Some people feel the federal government should play no role, and yet the federal government, since the Land Grant Act and back to the Northwest Ordinance, has played a major role. I think the federal government has a great responsibility in the field of education. We can't maintain our strength industrially, militarily, scientifically, socially without very well-educated citizenry. And I think the federal government has a role to play. So we're going to send up a program. Unfortunately, because of the fact, as you mentioned, and other reasons, we've come close to getting assistance to education passed, but we haven't been successful.
Mr. President, is your problem of getting an education bill through this year made more difficult by the events in Oxford, Mississippi, and the use of federal troops there?
Yes, I think so.
Well,
I think so.
How will you combat this new?
Well, as I say, we've got this is a case of where we've come very close. President Eisenhower came close. We came close once. We got a bill through the House, through the Senate, almost through the House. We didn't get it. And another trying for higher education through the Senate, the House, and then failed. The conference failed. Now Oxford, Mississippi, which has made this whole question of the federal government and education more sensitive in some parts of the country. I suppose that's going to be a factor against us. I don't really know what other role they would expect the President of the United States to play. The court, made up of Southern judges, determined that it was according to the Constitution that Mr. Meredith go to the University of Mississippi. The governor of Mississippi opposed it, and there was rioting against Mr. Meredith, which endangered his life. We sent in marshals, and after all, 150 or 60 marshals were wounded one way or another out of 400 or 500, and at least 3/4 of the marshals were from the South themselves. And then we sent in troops when it appeared that the marshals were going to be overrun. I don't think that anybody who looks at the situation could think we could possibly do anything else. But on the other hand, I recognize that it's caused a lot of bitterness against me and against the national government in Mississippi and other parts. Though they expect me to carry out my oath, Constitution, and that's what we're going to do, but it does make it more difficult to pass an education bill. But I think we shouldn't penalize this great resource of our youth for all these reasons. Instead, we ought to do the job and get these schools built, these teachers compensated, and higher education available to all these boys and girls. And every time I drive around the country, that's all you see are 6 and 7 and 8 and 9-year-old children who are going to be pouring into our schools and colleges. And every governor will tell you that's his major problem, providing educational facilities. Well, the national government has a responsibility.
If we could return for a moment to this subject of the President's responsibility in foreign affairs. Now, when some congressmen disagreed with your course of action over Cuba on that Monday, the responsibility you had by the Constitution was very clear. But in domestic matters where the responsibility is divided, how do you use the presidency, in Theodore Roosevelt's phrase, the bully pulpit, to move these men who really are kind of barons and sovereigns in their own right up there on the hill? Have you any way to move them toward a course of action which you think is imperative?
Well, the Constitution and the development of the Congress all give advantage to delay. It's very easy to defeat a bill in the Congress. It's much more difficult to pass one. To go through a committee, say the Ways and Means Committee of the House, a subcommittee and get a majority vote, the full committee, get a majority vote, go to the Rules Committee and get a rule, go to the floor of the House and get a majority, start over again in the Senate, subcommittee and full committee, and in the Senate there is unlimited debate, so you can never bring a matter to a vote if there's enough determination on the part of the opponents, even if they're a minority, to go through the Senate with the bill, and then unanimously get a conference between the House and Senate to adjust the bill, or if one member objects, to have it go back through the Rules Committee, back through the Congress, and have this done on a controversial piece of legislation where powerful groups are opposing it. That's an extremely difficult task, so that the struggle for a president who has a program to move it through the Congress, particularly when the seniority system may place particular individuals in key positions who may be wholly unsympathetic to your program, maybe even though they're members of your own party in political opposition to the president. This is a struggle which every president who's tried to get a program through has had to deal with. After all, Franklin Roosevelt was elected by the largest majority in history in 1936, and he got his worst defeat a few months afterwards in the Supreme Court bill. So that they are two separate offices and two separate powers, the Congress and the presidency. There's bound to be conflict, but they must cooperate to the degree that's possible. But that's why no president's program is ever put in. The only time a president's program is put in quickly and easily is when the program is insignificant. But if it's significant and affects important interests and is controversial, therefore, then there's a fight, and then the president is never wholly successful.
Well, Mr. President, which is the better part of wisdom? To take a bill that's completely emasculated, that you had great interest in, and accept it, or accept its defeat in the hope of building up public support for it at a later time?
Oh, I would say, given the conditions you described, I think it would be better to accept the defeat. But that usually what has happened, and what has happened to us in the last 2 years, a good many of our bills passed in reasonable position. Not the way we sent them up, but after all, the Congress has its own will to and own feelings and its own judgment, and they are close to the people. The whole House of Representatives have just been elected, so that it's quite natural that they will have a different perspective than I may have. So I would say that what we ought to do is do the best we can. But if it's completely emasculated, then there's no sense in having the shadow of success and not the substance.
Mr. President, in this exercise of presidential power, I think perhaps the best known case and the most widely talked about was your rollback of steel prices after they had been announced by the steel companies. Some people have suggested that in retrospect, perhaps you would not have acted so vigorously. Is there any truth in this suggestion?
No, I must say I think it would have been a very serious situation if, though I don't like to rake over old fires, I think it would have been a serious situation if I had not attempted with all my influence to try to get a rollback, because there was an issue of good faith involved. The steel union had accepted the most limited settlement that they had had since the end of the Second War. They had accepted it 3 or 4 months ahead. They did it in part, I think, because I said that we could not afford another inflationary spiral that would affect our competitive position abroad. So they signed up. And then when their last contract was signed, which was the Friday or Saturday before, then steel put its prices up immediately. Well, it seemed to me that that was the question of good faith was involved, and that if I had not attempted, after asking the unions to accept a non-inflationary settlement, if I hadn't attempted to use my influence to have the companies hold their prices stable, I think the unions could have rightfully felt that they had been misled. In my opinion, it would have endangered the whole bargaining between labor and management, would have made it impossible for us to exert any influence from the public point of view in the future on these great labor management disputes which do affect the public interest. So I have no regrets. The fact is we were successful. Now, supposing we had tried and made a speech about it and then failed, I would have thought that would have been an awful setback to the office of the presidency. Now, I just think that looking back on it, I wouldn't change it at all. There's no sense in raising hell and then not being successful. There's no sense putting the office of the presidency on the line on an issue and then being defeated. Now, an unfortunate...
What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another.
Every nation has a darker side, and the easiest thing for a politician to do is to appeal to our hatred and our anger and our bigotry and greed and xenophobia and all of the alchemies of demagoguery. My father and my uncle had a vision for America, a vision of racial harmony, of prosperity for all Americans, of peace in the world, and of honest government. Their lives were tragically cut short, and America took a different path. Yet the possibility they foresaw is still alive, the America that almost was and yet may be. I've been fighting corporate corruption my entire life, but I understand that today the problem is much larger than a few crooked individuals. The problem is a system that no longer serves the people, and a people who are so divided and so fearful that they are easily ruled. It's time to unlearn the reflexes of fear and blame and find ways to unify ourselves and turn our country around. I won't pretend to you that it will be easy, but I know what it will take. My father said it: love, wisdom, and compassion toward one another, and that's where we need to start. We will scale down the war machine and bring our resources home. We will rebuild our water systems, repair our roads, modernize our railroads, and clean up our environment. We will also clean up government and earn back the people's trust. We will end the secrecy, the censorship, and the surveillance. We will again be a fearless land of liberty.
The cost of freedom is always high, but Americans have always paid it.
We will face honestly the darker parts of our history, the genocide, the racism, not to shame or blame or punish, but to repair as best we can in a spirit of compassion and kindness toward all. I'm inviting all of you to join me to create an America that we can believe in and be proud of again. I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I'm running for President of the United States.